The message arrived on a Tuesday, which Ambassador Ilara Voss would later find funny because Tuesdays had always been her quiet days, the days she reserved for reading old Earth poetry and drinking tea that was never quite warm enough in the recycled air of the diplomatic station. The message was not poetry. It was a formal summons from the Conclave of 12, the ancient coalition of elder species that had governed known space for over 40,000 years, and it carried the kind of language that made her legal team go pale when they read it. Request for corrective dialogue, it said, stamped with the seal of High Arbiter Zorath Val himself. Ilara read it twice, then set it down on her desk, and looked out the window at the stars, the way she always did when she needed a moment to think without anyone watching her face. Her chief aide, a young man named Davi Chen, was the first to speak. "Ambassador, do you know what corrective dialogue means in conclave terms?" "I do. The Hethari were summoned for corrective dialogue 60 years ago. They were relocated to a radiation-scarred moon where half their population died within a decade. The Yulsong were summoned 90 years before that, and nobody has seen a living Ulsong since. The Vreniki were summoned 200 years ago, and their homeworld was sterilized from orbit." Ilara nodded slowly, her fingers resting on the edge of the summons as if it were something fragile and dangerous at the same time, like a grenade made of paper. "And now they have summoned us." The reason was not a mystery. Humanity had been expanding into the Riven Expanse, a vast stretch of unclaimed space that sat between the borders of 3 elder species territories, like a forgotten garden nobody had bothered to fence. 14 colonies built in 12 years, shipyards humming with activity, mining operations pulling rare minerals from asteroid belts that had drifted untouched for millennia. The Conclave had never formally claimed the Expanse. There was no treaty, no resolution, no document with signatures and dates. But among the elder species, there existed an unspoken understanding that unclaimed space belonged to them by right of age, by the sheer weight of having existed longer than anyone else. Humans had not received that memo, or if they had used it to line a drawer somewhere and forgotten about it entirely. Ilara spent the next 3 days studying everything humanity knew about the Conclave. Not the public records that painted them as wise shepherds guiding the galaxy toward peace, but the real records, the intelligence files, the intercepted communications, the pattern analysis that her analysts had been quietly building for decades. What she found confirmed what she already suspected. The Conclave did not negotiate. They had never negotiated, not once in 40,000 years of rule. Every corrective dialogue was a sentencing hearing dressed in the robes of diplomacy. A ritual where the condemned species was given the honor of hearing why it was about to be punished before the punishment fell. The elder species did not understand negotiation the way humans understood it. To them, a younger species coming to the table meant a younger species coming to kneel. The table was not a place of exchange, but a place of surrender. And the chairs were not seats, but positions of submission. Ilara found this fascinating and terrible in equal measure. She called a secure meeting with her full staff, 12 people who had spent their careers studying alien cultures, building relationships across species lines, and trying to find common ground in a galaxy that often seemed determined to have none. "Here is what I need you to understand," she told them, standing at the head of the conference table with her hands clasped behind her back, a habit she had picked up from her grandmother, who had been a schoolteacher in Lagos, and who had believed that the most important things should be said while standing still. "The Conclave has invited us to a conversation, but they do not mean the same thing by that word that we do. To them, conversation means lecture, dialogue means dictation, and negotiation means watching us crawl." She paused and let the silence do its work. "We are not going to crawl." Davi raised his hand, a gesture so earnest and human that it made Ilara smile despite everything. What are we going to do instead? We are going to negotiate, genuinely, honestly, with good faith and real terms. We are going to offer them something they have never been offered before. Partnership between equals. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of agreement, but the quiet of people trying to figure out if their boss had lost her mind. And if they say no? Asked Colonel Idris Mwangi, the military attaché who sat at the far end of the table and rarely spoke, but always listened with the kind of attention that made people feel like their words were being weighed on a scale. Alara looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them that the rest of the room could feel, but not name. If they say no, then they will have made their choice, and we will have made ours a long time ago. That evening, she sent 2 messages. The first was her reply to the conclave, polite, professional, containing no markers of deference or fear, no groveling language, no careful phrases designed to flatter ancient egos. Just a date, a time, and 3 words that would later be quoted in history books across 100 worlds. We will be there. The second message went to Earth, encrypted on a channel that only 7 people in the entire government had access to. It was addressed to Admiral Yuki Tanaka, commander of the United Earth Admiralty. They do not know what negotiation means. Prepare contingency longbow. Admiral Tanaka read the message in her office overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where the sun was setting in colors that no alien species had ever seen, because no alien species had ever bothered to visit Earth. They considered it a backwater, a young world full of a young species that had only been walking among the stars for 300 years. She read it once, then picked up her coffee, took a long sip, and said a single word to her aide: begin. Across human space, in shipyards hidden behind gas giants, and weapons platforms buried inside asteroids, and command centers built into the hearts of dead moons, things began to move, quietly, carefully, with the patient discipline of a species that had learned the hardest lesson the universe had to offer long before it ever left its home planet. Peace was a beautiful thing, and humanity loved it dearly, never once made the mistake of thinking it would last forever. That was what made them different from every other species the Conclave had ever summoned. Every other species had believed the galaxy was safe. Humans knew better. The Grand Deliberation Chamber on Aethera Prime had been designed to make visitors feel small, and it was very good at its job. The ceiling rose so high above the floor that clouds sometimes formed in the upper reaches. Real clouds, made of moisture drawn from the ventilation system, and left to drift like ghosts between the ancient stone arches. The walls were lined with carvings that told the history of the conclave in images that stretched back 40,000 years, each panel showing a moment of triumph, a war won, a species brought to heel, a galaxy shaped by the will of those who sat in the towering seats above. And the seats were towering, 12 of them, arranged in a crescent, that loomed over the chamber floor like a wave about to break. Each one carved from stone native to the homeworld of the species it represented. Each one positioned so that whoever sat below had to crane their neck to look up at the counselors. It was brilliant architecture, thought, as she walked across the polished floor with her small delegation behind her. Brilliant and obvious, like a bully who stands on a chair to look taller. She did not look up. She walked to the small table that had been placed in the center of the floor, a table so low and so plain that it was clearly meant to remind her of her place. And she sat down, opened her case, and began arranging her notes as if she were preparing for a Tuesday afternoon meeting about trade tariffs. Davi sat to her left. Colonel Mwangi sat to her right. The legal scholar, Dr. Amina Okafor, sat beside Davi, with a tablet full of precedents and a quiet fury in her eyes that she kept carefully hidden behind her glasses. Above them, the conclave watched. High Arbiter Zorath Vel was the largest presence in the room, not just because of his size. He was Vraxi, an insectoid species that stood nearly 3 meters tall on 6 articulated legs, with mandibles that clicked when he was thinking and compound eyes that reflected light like shattered mirrors. But because of the weight of his authority, the sheer gravitational pull of a being who had ruled over civilizations for longer than humanity had known how to write, he opened the session with a speech that lasted 40 minutes. Elara listened to every word. She did not fidget. She did not sigh. She did not check her notes. She listened the way her grandmother had taught her to listen, with her whole body still, and her mind turning every sentence over like a stone to see what was hiding underneath. The speech was about order, about the sacred duty of elder species to guide the galaxy, about the natural hierarchy that placed wisdom above ambition and age above youth, about how younger species must learn to walk within the paths that had been laid for them by those who came before. It was, Elara realized, not a speech at all. It was a verdict delivered before the trial had begun. Zorath Vel finished. The chamber fell silent, and 12 pairs of alien eyes looked down at the small human woman at the small table on the vast floor, waiting for her to do what every other species had done in this room: beg, bargain from weakness, or simply accept the inevitable. Elara looked at her notes, then looked up, not at Zorath Vel but at the space between the counselors, as if she were addressing the room itself. Thank you, High Arbiter, for that thorough explanation of the Conclave's perspective. I have a few questions before we proceed, if the Council permits. Questions. The word rippled through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. Species summoned for corrective dialogue did not ask questions, they answered them. Zorath Vel's mandibles clicked twice. You may ask, under which specific statute of Conclave law is humanity's colonization of the Riven Expanse considered a violation? Silence. Direct me to the relevant treaty that designates the Expanse as reserved territory. More silence. Is there a formal Conclave resolution, one with a date, a vote count, and the signatures of participating members, that claims sovereign or custodial rights over the Riven Expanse? The silence this time was not empty. It was full, stuffed to bursting with the discomfort of 12 ancient species, realizing that the small woman at the small table had just asked them to show their cards, and their hands were empty. Counselor Dreth was the first to break. A Saranax, reptilian and proud, with scales the color of burnt copper, and a voice that sounded like gravel being ground between millstones. Custom is law, he snarled, leaning forward in his seat so that his shadow fell across Elara like a blade. Your species is young. Your ignorance of our ways does not excuse your trespass. Elara did not flinch. She did not lean back or look away or show any of that. Small signs of submission that the Saranax had been reading from other species for thousands of years. If custom were law, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the enormous chamber, you would not need this chamber. The sound that Dreth made was not a word in any language. It was pure rage, compressed into a single hiss that echoed off the ancient walls. But Elara was already moving on. She opened her case and produced a document, printed on actual paper because she had learned that the elder species found physical documents more serious than digital ones, a small cultural detail that most human diplomats overlooked, but that Elara treated as a weapon. The human delegation has prepared a formal proposal for the Council's consideration, she said, and her voice was steady and warm, the voice of someone offering a gift rather than defending a position. The proposal was generous. Shared development rights in the Riven Expanse, trade agreements that would benefit elder species economies, mutual defense pacts that would extend human military protection to Conclave borders, technology exchanges, cultural programs, joint scientific ventures. It was the kind of offer that any rational actor would spend weeks analyzing, because it was so comprehensively beneficial that there had to be a catch. But there was no catch. That was the catch. Humanity was offering partnership, real partnership, the kind that required trust and mutual respect, and the acknowledgement that both sides had something valuable to bring to the table. The conclave did not see a generous offer. They saw an insult. A younger species does not propose terms to its elders. A younger species does not come to the table with a plan, with confidence, with the audacity to suggest that it has something the conclave needs. That was not how the universe worked, not how it had ever worked, not how it would ever work. Zorath Vel did not read the proposal. He set it aside with one long segmented limb, the way someone might move a piece of trash from their desk. Humanity is given 30 standard days to withdraw all personnel, infrastructure, and assets from the Riven Expanse. Failure to comply will result in corrective action. This session is concluded. Elara nodded. She gathered her notes, closed her case, and stood. Then she paused. You have made your position clear, High Arbiter. I want to make sure you understand something in return. She looked around the chamber, at all 12 counselors, at the ancient carvings on the walls, at the clouds drifting near the ceiling of a room built to crush the spirit of anyone who stood on its floor. This was your chance too. She turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the silence she left behind. Colonel Mwangi walked beside her, and as they passed through the great doors of the chamber, he leaned close and spoke in a voice only she could. Here they did not read the proposal. No, Elara said. They are going to send their fleet. Yes, and then? Elara kept walking, her eyes forward, her back straight, her grandmother's voice in her head, telling her that the most important thing about leaving a room was making sure everyone remembered exactly how you left it. And then they are going to wish they had read it. On the first day after the summons, Elara stood before the United Admiralty in a bunker carved into granite beneath the Swiss Alps, and told them the truth, without decoration or softening. They gave us 30 days. They will not negotiate. They have never negotiated with anyone. Every species that has stood where I stood either submitted or was destroyed, and the conclave fully expects us to be the next in a very long line of obedient children. Admiral Yuki Tanaka sat at the center of the long table, her hands folded, her face showing nothing. She had a gift for stillness that made people forget she was in the room until she spoke. And when she spoke, the room always listened. What is your recommendation, Ambassador? We give them exactly what they expect to see: panic, confusion, retreat. We make them believe we are falling apart, and while they are watching us crumble, we prepare Longbow. Longbow was not a battle plan. It had never been a battle plan, even though the weapons it involved could crack a planet's crust if pointed in the wrong direction. It was something more subtle and more dangerous than a battle plan. It was a revelation. For 60 years, ever since humanity first realized that the galaxy was run by species who viewed younger civilizations the way a landlord views mice, the United Admiralty had been building. Not openly, not aggressively, not in ways that would attract attention, but steadily, patiently, with the quiet determination of people who had read enough history to know that the strong do not stay peaceful because they are kind, but because they choose to be, and that choice requires the ability to be something other than peaceful when the time comes. Hidden shipyards behind gas giants had been producing warships for decades. Not the clunky, slow vessels that humanity showed to the galaxy at trade fairs and diplomatic functions, but real warships, fast and networked and armed, with weapons that human engineers had developed in laboratories so secret that even most of the Admiralty did not know their locations. Weapons platforms had been buried inside asteroids along every major approach route to human space. Command centers had been built into dead moons with redundant communication systems that could survive the destruction of entire relay networks. Supply caches had been hidden in the deep dark between stars, enough to sustain a full military campaign for years without resupply from Earth. And all of it had been done quietly, over decades, by people who understood that preparation was not aggression, that building a fence was not the same as throwing the first punch, that the best way to avoid a fight was to make sure that anyone who started one would regret it deeply and permanently. Admiral Tanaka authorized Longbow with a single nod. Across human space, the performance began. Civilian evacuations were announced on open channels. Merchant vessels were recalled in panicked bursts of communication that the Conclave's intelligence services intercepted with ease. Border colonies went dark one by one, their lights fading like candles being blown out by a wind that smelled of fear. The Conclave watched all of this and saw exactly what they expected to see. A young species coming apart at the seams, scrambling to save what it could before the hammer fell. On Athara Prime, High Arbiter Zorath Vel received the intelligence reports with satisfaction. His compound eyes reflected the data screens as he reviewed the evidence of humanity's collapse, and his mandibles clicked in the slow rhythm that the Vraxi used to express contentment. As expected, he told the assembled council, they run, they always run. The young species always run when they realize that custom is not a suggestion, but the foundation upon which the galaxy stands. The other counselors agreed. Dreth, the Soranax, showed his teeth in what passed for a smile among his kind. The Tarathi delegation hummed a low frequency that meant approval. The Ulsong chair sat empty, as it had for 90 years. A reminder that the Conclave's patience had limits that no one tested twice. Only Counselor Yamara did not agree. Yamara was Aleph, the oldest species in the Conclave, older even than the Vraxi. Her body was luminous, shifting between states of matter in ways that other species found beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. And her mind was vast, in the way that deep oceans are vast, full of currents and pressures that the surface never showed. She had been studying humans. Not the intelligence reports, not the intercepted communications, not the carefully staged performance of panic that the Conclave spies were so proud of collecting. She had been studying human history, the real history, the history that humans wrote about themselves in their own languages for their own. She had read about their wars, and there had been so many wars, so many that the sheer number of them made her luminous body dim with something that might have been sorrow or might have been fear. Wars fought over land and resources and ideas and pride and religion and freedom, and sometimes for reasons that even the humans themselves could not fully explain. But she had also read about what came after the wars, the treaties, the rebuilding, the stubborn insistence on trying again, on sitting down at tables with enemies and talking until the talking worked, or until it became clear that talking would never work, at which point the humans did not give up. They simply changed the nature of the conversation. And she had noticed something in the intelligence reports that everyone else had missed. The humans were evacuating civilians, not military personnel, not equipment, not weapons. Civilians, families, children, elderly, the people who could not fight and should not have to. Imara knew what that meant. She had lived long enough to recognize the pattern, even though no species in the Conclave's history had ever shown it so clearly. You do not evacuate the people you love from a place you intend to surrender. You evacuate them from a place you intend to turn into a battlefield. She went to Zorath Vel privately, in his chambers where the light was dim and the air smelled of the chemical markers that the Vraxi used to think clearly. I have concerns, she said. You always have concerns, Imara. They are not running, they are clearing the ground. Zorath Vel's mandibles stopped clicking. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his compound eyes that might have been doubt. But it passed, buried under 40,000 years of certainty that the Conclave was the strongest force in the galaxy, and that no young species could change that. They are children, he said. 3. Centuries in the void. We have ruled for 40,000 years. Post. Ymara's light shifted to a color that had no name in any language but her own. A color that meant sadness for someone who would not listen. And in 3 centuries, they have fought more wars among themselves than we have fought in all our millennia. Do not mistake youth for weakness, Zoreth. Do not mistake silence for surrender. He dismissed her with a wave of his segmented limb, and she left his chambers knowing that she had failed, and that failure would have a cost measured in something heavier than words. On day 25, the Conclave's combined fleet began massing at the edge of the riven expanse. Over 8,000 warships from 9 elder species, a force so large that it bent the light of nearby stars with the gravity of its collective mass. It was the largest military assembly in 6,000 years, and it moved with the slow, confident inevitability of a tide that had never once been turned. Back on day 28, Ilara sent her final message. It arrived on every Conclave communication channel simultaneously, transmitted in all 12 elder languages and in English, because Ilara believed that if you were going to say something important, you should say it in your own voice as well as in the voices of those who needed to hear it. The message was short. We came to the table in good faith. We offered partnership. You offered subjugation. This message constitutes formal notice. Any hostile incursion into human-held space will be treated as an act of war. This is not a threat. It is a courtesy, the last one we will extend. Zorath Vel read it aloud to the full council, and the chamber filled with the sound of alien laughter. 12 species laughing in 12 different ways, a chorus of amusement and contempt that echoed off the carved walls where the history of the Conclave's victories was written in stone. They found the word courtesy especially entertaining. On day 30, Ymara stood alone in her quarters and looked out at the stars and thought about a species that said exactly what it meant and meant exactly what it said, and she wondered if the galaxy was ready for what was coming. The Conclave Armada crossed into the riven expanse at dawn on day 31. Though dawn was a meaningless word in the void between stars, there was no sun to rise, no horizon to break, only the endless dark and the cold light of distant galaxies watching from impossibly far away, like the eyes of something ancient and indifferent. 8,000 warships moved in formation, their hulls gleaming with the reflected light of their own running beams, each one carrying weapons that had ended civilizations and crews that had served the Conclave for generations without ever knowing defeat. Admiral Krev of the Saranax commanded the vanguard from the bridge of the flagship Undeniable, a vessel so large that it had its own weather systems in its cargo bays. He stood at the tactical display, with his copper scales catching the blue glow of the holographic maps, and his teeth showing in the permanent half-smile of a predator who had never met anything higher on the food chain. Plan was simple, because the Conclave believed simple plans were all that young species deserved. Advance in overwhelming force, occupy the 14 human colonies, dismantle the shipyards, and leave behind a garrison that would remind humanity of its place for the next 1,000 years. They expected resistance, a few hundred human ships, maybe, making a brave and doomed stand at the border, fighting with the desperate energy of a species that had realized too late that courage was not a substitute for power. What they found was nothing. The border was empty. The colonies were dark. The shipyards were silent. The stations that had buzzed with human activity for over a decade sat in the void like abandoned houses with their doors hanging open and their lights turned off. Admiral Krev ordered his fleet to slow and spread sensor nets across the approach routes. The absence of resistance was more unsettling than resistance would have been, like walking into a bar. Forest. and realizing that every bird had stopped singing at the same time. "Where are they?" Counselor Dreth demanded from his secure channel on Aethera Prime, his voice grinding through the speakers like stone against stone. "Fled," Krev answered, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that he could not quite suppress. "They have abandoned their positions. We will occupy and hold." The armada advanced deeper into the expanse, past the first ring of empty colonies, past the silent mining stations, past the dark shipyards where human workers had built their little ships and dreamed their little dreams. They were 3 hours into the expanse when Longbow activated. It began with the communications. Every Conclave ship lost contact with every other Conclave ship in the span of 4 seconds, their encrypted channels shredded by electronic warfare systems that had been sleeping inside modified asteroids for years. Then the sensors went blind. Not jammed in the crude way that younger species typically managed, with brute force noise that could be filtered out, but blinded with surgical precision, each frequency targeted individually, each backup system anticipated and neutralized before it could activate. And then the dark lit up. From behind moons and inside asteroid fields, and from the shadows of gas giants, where no sensor had thought to look, human ships appeared. Not hundreds, but thousands, emerging from hiding places that had been prepared years in advance, each one running dark until the moment the signal came, and then blazing to life like stars being born. Colonel Idris Wangi stood on the bridge of the UES Last Word, the flagship of the Human Response Fleet, and watched the tactical display paint itself with blue markers that outnumbered the red ones in ways the Conclave had never imagined possible. The ships were not what the galaxy expected from humanity. They were not the slow, blocky cargo vessels that human merchants flew between trading posts, not the modest patrol craft that guarded shipping lanes. They were something else entirely, sleek and fast, and networked together by communication systems so advanced that the entire fleet moved like a single organism with 4,000 bodies. They carried weapons the Conclave had never seen. Kinetic lances that accelerated tungsten rods to a fraction of light speed, directed gravity warheads that could crush a ship's hull by bending space around it, and pulse systems that could disable a vessel's power grid without scratching its paint. Wangi's orders had come directly from Admiral Tanaka, and they were the most unusual battle orders any human commander had ever received. Minimum casualties, maximum message. The engagement lasted 6 hours, and it was not a battle in any sense that the Conclave understood. It was a demonstration, a carefully choreographed performance of overwhelming competence, designed not to destroy, but to educate. Human ships did not target reactors or life support, or crew quarters. They targeted engines, weapons arrays, and communication nodes with a precision so fine that Conclave commanders later described it as surgical, though surgery implied a doctor working to save a patient, and what the humans were doing was closer to a teacher taking dangerous toys away from children who did not understand what they were holding. Flagship after flagship went dark, not destroyed, not burning, not leaking atmosphere into the void, but simply stopped, their weapons offline, their engines cold, their proud crews sitting in ships that had become very expensive and very large waiting rooms. Admiral Krev watched from the bridge of the undeniable as his fleet was taken apart around him. His tactical display, which had shown 8,000 warships in proud formation, now showed a scattered field of disabled vessels surrounded by human ships that moved between them like wolves walking through a flock of sheep that had never seen a wolf before. 3 elder species battle groups tried to break formation and fight aggressively. The Saranax Vanguard, the Tarathi heavy cruisers, and a Vraxi assault wing that had been the pride of Zorath Vel's military for 2,000 years. All 3 were surrounded within minutes. The human ships simply appeared around them in numbers that made resistance not just futile, but embarrassing. And one by one, the battle groups powered down their weapons and signaled surrender. The Vraxi assault wing was the last to yield, their commander screaming orders into a communication system that was no longer connected to anything. When the humans boarded the flagship, they found the crew standing at their stations in rigid formation, mandibles clicking in the Vraxi expression of absolute humiliation. The human boarding team was led by a young lieutenant named Sarah Park, who looked at the defeated Vraxi crew with no triumph in her eyes, only the calm professionalism of someone doing a job that needed to be done with dignity. "Please come with us," she said, and led them to a holding area that the humans had prepared in advance. Not a prison cell, not a bare room with harsh lights, but a comfortable space with seating designed for Vraxi anatomy, lighting adjusted to frequencies that the Vraxi found soothing, and, most bewildering of all, tea. Hot tea, served in cups that had been specially made to fit Vraxi manipulator limbs, brewed from leaves that grew on a small blue planet that the Conclave had never bothered to visit. The Vraxi commander stared at the tea for a long time, his compound eyes reflecting the steam rising from the cup. And he did not understand what kind of species defeats you in battle and then offers you a warm drink as if you were a guest who had arrived in bad. On Aethera Prime, Zorath Vel watched the battle feed in his chambers, alone, because he had ordered everyone else out when the scale of what was happening became clear. His mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, which among the Vraxi meant that the mind behind them had encountered something it could not process. His fleet, the combined might of 9 elder species, the largest military force assembled in 6,000 years, had been rendered completely helpless in 6 hours by a species that had learned to split the atom only 500 years ago. Not destroyed, that was the part that burned. Not defeated in the way the Conclave understood defeat, with burning hulls and expanding clouds of debris and the silence of the dead, but stopped, contained, held in place by a force that could have destroyed them, and chose not to. The door to his chambers opened, and Counselor Ymara entered without asking permission, her luminous body casting soft light. Across the walls where the shadows of his humiliation were thickest. She did not say, "I told you so." She was too old and too wise for words that small. Instead, she asked a question, and it was the only question that mattered. "Do you understand now what negotiation meant to them?" Zorath Vel did not answer, but his mandibles began to click again, slowly, painfully, in the rhythm the Vraxi used for grief. The grand deliberation chamber looked different the second time, though nothing about it had changed. The ceiling still rose into clouds. The carving still told 40,000 years of Conclave triumph. The 12 seats still towered above the floor in their crescent of ancient stone. But the room felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved inward during the night, as if the architecture that had been designed to crush the spirit of younger species had turned on the ones who built it, and was crushing them instead. Elara Voss walked across the same polished floor, sat at the same low table, and opened the same case. Davi Chen sat to her left, Colonel Mwangi to her right, Dr. Amina Okafor beside Davi, with her tablet and her glasses and her quiet fury that was no longer hidden, because there was no longer any reason to hide it. Above them, the Conclave waited, but the waiting was different now. It was not the patient waiting of predators watching prey walk into a trap, but the tense, brittle waiting of people who had just learned something about themselves that they did not want to know. Several counselors could not meet Alara's eyes. Dreth the Saranax sat rigid in his seat, his copper scales dull in the chamber light, his teeth hidden behind lips pressed tight with something that looked like pain. The Tarathi were silent for the first time anyone could remember, their constant low hum of communication reduced to nothing. Zorath Vel sat in his great seat at the center of the crescent, and he looked old, not in the way that the Vraxi usually aged, with slow dignity and the accumulated weight of wisdom, but in the way that anything looks old, when the thing that held it together has cracked. His compound eyes were dim, his mandibles barely moved, and his segmented limbs rested on the arms of his seat, as if they were too heavy to lift. The only counselor who looked the same as before was Imara, luminous body shifting through gentle colors, watching Ilara with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been curiosity, or might have been the particular kind of sadness that comes from being right about something you wished you had been wrong about. Ilara arranged her notes, the same order, the same careful placement on the low table that had been meant to remind her of her place. Then she spoke, and her voice was exactly what it had been the first time, steady, warm, carrying no triumph, no gloating, no satisfaction, nothing that the conclave could point to and call arrogance, because there was no arrogance in it. The human delegation presents the following proposal for the council's consideration. She placed the document on the table. Paper, real paper, the same kind she had used before, and she began to read. Shared development rights in the Riven Expanse, trade agreements benefiting elder species economies, mutual defense pacts extending human military protection to conclave borders, technology exchanges, cultural programs, joint scientific ventures. Word for word, clause for clause, number for number, it was the same proposal she had offered 32 days ago, the one that Zoroth Vel had pushed aside without reading, the one that the conclave had laughed at, because a younger species daring to propose terms was the funniest thing they had heard in centuries. The same proposal, unchanged, not a single word added, not a single term altered, not a single comma moved from where it had been the first time she placed it on this table in this room. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had ever happened in the grand deliberation chamber. Zoroth Vel was the one who broke it, and when he spoke, his voice was raw in a way that the Vraxi language did not have words for, because the Vraxi had never needed words for what he was feeling. Disabled our armada in 6 hours. Your ships are holding our commanders in comfort while our vessels sit powerless in your space. You have the advantage, Ambassador. Why are you not using it? He leaned forward, and for the first time, he was looking down at Ilara, not from a position of power, but from a position of desperate confusion. Like a man who has lived his entire life believing the sun rises in the east, and has just watched it rise in the west. You could demand territory. You could demand tribute. You could demand the dissolution of this council and the surrender of our homeworlds. Your military has proven it has the power. Why are you offering us the same terms you offered when you had nothing? Ilara looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that the conclave had never seen from a younger species. Not fear, not defiance, not even confidence, but something quieter and more dangerous than any of those things. Patience. Because we did not come here to conquer you, she said. We came here to be your partners. We offered you that before you sent your fleet. We are offering it again now that your fleet is in our repair docks. The terms have not changed, because the goal never changed. She stood, not because the moment required it, but because her grandmother had taught her that some things need to be said while standing. We do not want to rule the galaxy, Arbiter. We want to live in it, alongside you, not beneath you. We want to build things together that neither of us could build alone. We want our children and your children to grow up in a galaxy that is bigger and better and more interesting than the one we were born into. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer but carried more weight, the way a river is softer than a hammer, but moves mountains that hammers cannot touch. But I need you to understand something. You had a choice. You chose to send warships. We answered that. If you choose wrong again, there will not be a third meeting in this chamber. Not because we will destroy you, but because you will have proven that this institution is not worth talking to, and we will build something new without you, something that works, something that does not require 40,000 years of tradition to justify treating younger species like servants. She sat back down and folded her hands on the table and waited. The chamber was quiet for a long time, longer than any silence in the history of the conclave, longer than the silence after wars, and longer than the silence after extinctions. It was the silence of 12 ancient species, staring at the wreckage of everything they had believed about themselves and the galaxy and their place in it. Ymara spoke first. Her voice was like light-given sound, warm and clear, and carrying the weight of being the oldest living thing in a room full of old things. I vote to accept. The words fell into the silence like seeds into turned earth, and for a moment nothing grew from them. Then, slowly, painfully, with the reluctance of beings who had never bent and were learning for the first time what bending felt like, the other counselors began to speak. The Torathi voted yes. The Cathari voted yes. 3 more species followed, each vote coming like a tooth being pulled, necessary and agonizing. Dreth the Sournax voted no, his voice a snarl of wounded pride that echoed off the walls. But he was alone in his refusal, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat on his copper scales like ash. Zorath Vel voted last. He looked at Alara for a long time, his compound eyes reflecting her small figure at the small table on the vast floor. And something shifted in those fractured mirrors that might have been the beginning of understanding. Yes, he said, and the word cost him more than any word he had ever been. The vote passed, not unanimously, but decisively. And the document that Alara had carried into this chamber twice was signed by 11 of 12 counselors, with marks and symbols and genetic imprints that made it binding under laws older than human civilization. Alara gathered her notes, closed her case, and stood for the last time in the grand deliberation chamber. She walked out with her delegation beside her, and the doors closed behind them with a sound that felt like the ending of one story and the beginning of another. Outside, the air of Aethara Prime was cool and carried the scent of alien flowers that bloomed only at night, and the sky was full of stars that looked the same from every world in the galaxy, no matter how old or how young the eyes that watched them. Colonel Mwangi walked beside her in his usual silence, but after they had gone far enough from the chamber that their words belonged only to them, he spoke. Will hold. Ilara looked back at the ancient building, at its towering spires and carved walls, and the weight of 40,000 years pressing down on a foundation that had just developed its first crack. She thought about the 12 species inside, about Zorath Vel learning to say yes, about Ymara, who had understood before anyone else, about Dreth, who had not understood and might never understand, about the tea that a young lieutenant had served to defeated enemies, because that was what humans did when someone came in from the cold. She thought about her grandmother in Lagos, standing still at the front of a classroom, teaching children that the most powerful thing in the world was not a fist, but an open hand, and that the bravest thing a person could do was offer that hand to someone who had tried to hurt them. It will hold, she said, because now they know what happens if it does not. They walked to their shuttle in the alien night, 2 humans on a world that was not theirs, under stars that belonged to everyone, and behind them the galaxy turned slowly on its axis, the way it always had and always would, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell within it, but perhaps, just perhaps, a little more interesting now that humanity had pulled up a chair. 300 years later, a galactic historian whose name has been lost to time wrote a single passage that survived the centuries and was taught in schools on 1,000 worlds, a passage that said everything that needed to be said about what happened in the Grand Deliberation Chamber on Aethara Prime, on the day that everything changed. The Conclave had believed that when humans said negotiation, they meant submission. They learned, at great cost to their pride and none to their people, that humans meant something far more dangerous.